For too long, domestic violence has been an invisible epidemic, hidden behind closed doors, misunderstood, and too often dismissed. At the S.E.E.N Summit, we believe every story deserves to be heard, every survivor deserves to be believed, and every person has the power to make a difference. Together, we are disarming domestic violence by shining a light on what's been unseen. With each episode, we are building awareness, deepening understanding, and creating space for healing and change. This is the S.E.E.N Summit Podcast, making the invisible visible, one conversation at a time.
Thank you so much for joining me on the S.E.E.N Summit Podcast. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. For those of you who are listening today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Abi McLane. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the YWCA of Pierce County in Tacoma, Washington. She is a senior level leader with over a decade of experience guiding multidisciplinary, a word I had to practice, teams to advance gender equity, violence prevention, and community advocacy. She's deeply involved in regional advocacy and speaks regularly on topics like community healing, faith, and social justice. So thank you, Abi, for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
So I get to pick your brain about lots of things today, but I just want to start off talking a little bit about the YWCA and the resource it is, because I think there's a lot more to it than we kind of picture. So can you tell me a little bit about it and how it uniquely supports survivors?
Yeah. So the YWCA Pierce County has been in this community for 120 years. So we're celebrating our 120th anniversary this year. And we've always been here with the mission of serving women and girls and creating a space in which people could come together in community, and then also serving a need that is most present and impactful. And 50 years ago, what came out was that there was no place for survivors of intimate partner violence to go in our community. And so the YWCA saw that need. And what it did is it rehabbed a section of our main building at 405 Broadway and created the first domestic violence shelter in the state of Washington. So Pierce County was the first place in the state of Washington to identify, recognize, and develop a shelter that was specifically to work with survivors and children. And so we've now had this shelter in our community for 50 years. 15 years ago, we had an opportunity to purchase a apartment building in downtown Tacoma and renovate that apartment building. And now we have a 22-unit domestic violence shelter. So when survivors and survivors with children come into the shelter, they are coming into their own individual apartment unit. So it has a full kitchen, a full bathroom, a dining space. The only thing that is shared is a food pantry, which we have stocked through a partnership with the Emergency Food Network. There is both non-perishable and perishable items in there, like a full shopping experience for the residents in our shelter. And then we also have a laundry room. And we have a playground that is outside just for our shelter. And our shelter also really recognizes the interconnections between violence in the family and violence towards animals. And we know too that for a lot of survivors, it's like non-negotiable leaving their pet. So we accept pets. And last time I chatted with our shelter team, we had multiple cats, a few dogs, and a bearded lizard in the shelter. So yeah, I mean, that's another thing we're up to here. So we want to make sure that families are able to come and be able to really start working on their healing. And if part of that means that they have their cat with them, we want to make sure they can do that. The other really beautiful thing about the shelter is because it's apartment style, it allows people to have children with them of all ages. We recently had a family where the child was, just coming out of their 18th year of life. And often in many shelters, that would mean that you're not able to bring that kiddo with you. But anybody who has like recently had an 18-year-old can tell you that they probably still need a lot of parental support. And so it was really meaningful for that survivor that they were able to have that child with them. So even though that child was technically a voting legal adult, they were able to be with their caregiver, their parent, while their parent was working on their next step. And then beyond that shelter, We have a community advocacy program that does advocacy for survivors who are not in the shelter. They will work with people once or for years, depending on what the survivor identifies needing. That team also does our education and outreach work in local schools. So they go out into middle and high schools and do education and prevention. They talk about what healthy love looks like. They talk about what unhealthy markers can look like in a relationship and how to identify those things as these kiddos are growing up and becoming folks that are in intimate partner relationships. Then that team also runs our support group. So they run a 12-week support group. They run it 4 times a year, 2 in person, 2 virtual. And they do a really beautiful curriculum with a group of survivors who are able to, one, create that community together, but also get that ongoing intensive education around what healthy relationships look like, around reestablishing of boundaries, and really setting up for that next phase and step of life for the survivor. Our community program is also co-located with our counseling program. So we have a free counseling program that has counselors who deeply understand the impacts of violence on family systems, what it does to individuals and families, and they are able to provide free therapeutic services to clients. And then we also have a legal program. And the legal program works with survivors who are needing to address the legal aspects, the civil legal aspects of their cases. Then we have a children's program, and our children's program it's a whole floor of one of our buildings, and it is gorgeous. It's has murals painted all over the building, bright colored furniture. It's just absolutely gorgeous to be in. And it is staffed with team members who specialize in working with kiddos who have experienced trauma in their families, and they provide respite care 5 days a week. So, respite care from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. most of the time. And then during the summer, they also have started doing a summer camp so that kiddos who are in the shelter have access to a summer camp and get to have those fun summer memories and activities. And they do co-occurring programming as well. So, like when we're doing our support groups in the evening, the children's program also does programming for kiddos whose parents are in the support group, and the programming mirrors some of the things that parents might be learning, but at an age appropriate level for the kiddos and relevant to the kids' space, so that the family is doing that healing together. Because, really ultimately our goal is that we're not just saying, hey, survivor, here's things for you, but we're saying, like, hey, survivor and family, hey, survivor and community, here are resources, and this is what this can look like. And then we have a transitional housing program. So our shelter team not only supports the 22 units of the shelter, but they also support 23 units of transitional housing through a partnership with Housing Pierce County. And survivors are their place-based vouchers. So typically folks are in there for, anywhere from like a year to 2 years. They're able to have that intensive case management of a domestic violence advocate as they work on their next step of getting into that next step of longer term stable housing. And then we also, a number of years ago, said, what's the thing we keep seeing as an agency for survivors that's a barrier to like really being able to launch and take that next step? And what kept coming up is that like people will go through the shelter and there's not that next step in housing, right? There's not enough affordable housing stock in our community. And this is, by no means like unique to us discovering this. This is a very well documented issue in our region, that there's not a lot of affordable housing stock. And so a number of years ago, the former senior leadership team said, you know what, we just need to develop more affordable housing. And so that team got together and worked with the community, and they developed a 55-unit affordable housing apartment building, which is right across the street from our building that I'm in.
Wow, it's so
Yeah.
holistic. And so
Yeah.
you've reverse answered one of the things I wanted to ask you about, but maybe you can speak more to it. And that is, you've given us all of this insight into these lists of services that you provide, but talk to me a little bit about what
Mhm.
are the barriers that
Yeah.
women are facing that these are all the answers to.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things we work with survivors of intimate partner violence. So domestic violence is like a pretty, and it's not a broad term, but it's a term that's more encompassing than just intimate partnerships. So domestic violence, the definition of that in the state of Washington would include like family members, roommates, anything like that. We as an organization wish we could serve everybody, but that is not the reality of our resources. It's not the reality of the resources we've allocated as a community to this work. So we have really chosen to focus on intimate partner violence. And the reason we have chosen to do that is one, in intimate partner violence cases, it tends to be the highest rates of lethality. So we really wanted to say, we have a finite amount of resources and we want to make sure that we are serving those who are in the highest risk pool. That's not to say that there isn't other forms of family violence that result in lethal situations, but in looking at holistically, like what is the cases most likely to, these were the ones that we identified wanting to put our resources into, our limited resources into. And so with survivors, one of the big things that we see is that oftentimes in abuse, the abusers will try to isolate or cut survivors off from resources. So when we're working with survivors, sometimes even having access to like a phone that they're able to do connections with care on is limited. We'll see like their ability to get into physically into services is limited. So we have had to get really creative. So doing care virtually. We have a program where we can get survivors phones, really trying to address those barriers as we see them come up. But the biggest thing that we see that are barriers to survivors being able to engage in care is that isolation and then financial abuse, right? Like everything is harder when you don't have access to resources. That's just the truth for anybody, right? It is exponentially harder to secure safety when you don't have access to any money to do that. It is exponentially harder to secure safety when everything you're doing is being monitored. So we see those as, when we're talking about barriers to folks getting engaged, two of the largest barriers just from the jump is those strategic ways that abusers can implement abuse.
And I think that that's important to call out because sometimes I think the temptation is to think, well, why can't they just go stay with a friend? And
Mhm.
does that really offer safety? And so what are the differences between what are probably a lot of assumptions like they could just go, they could just do that? Why is
Mhm.
the intentionality and all of the really specific
Mhm.
ways that we're providing resources, why is that important?
Yeah. Well, I think one, most friends haven't been trained on how to support somebody experiencing domestic violence. So, like, that's step one. And even the most well intending friend. So, if you still have resource and access to friends, right? Because there's a very high likelihood that that resource and access has been cut off. Um, and like, if you have access to that part of your community still, and that's a community that you can still reach out to and engage in, most people haven't been trained in the dynamics of abuse. And so they unknowingly will say or perpetuate or reinforce elements of the abuse. So, he really only does that when he's drinking, or, they really have just that's their sense of humor, right? Or, I've seen you do X, Y, and Z too, right? So, like, unintentionally, sometimes people can reinforce that. Or they'll say things like, well, obviously they're a piece of crap. You shouldn't go back to them. You're better than this. And then if the survivor does reunite with the person causing harm, there's a lot of shame because they're like, well, my friend told me I shouldn't get back together with them. And now I am. And like, I'm embarrassed. So I'm like, not going to talk to them anymore. But the other thing we see a lot is people want to help their family members and they'll like often put in a lot of energy and put in what resources they have. And the reality of intimate partner violence is that for many survivors, it's not this like linear thing. It's something where there's like all these loops and turns and there's these different things that happen. And I think the thing we always forget about, people always forget about, and I like to remind them is like, just as much as I love my husband, survivors love their partners too. And I think that like that's something that people can forget and they can be really dismissive of the fact that there can be these feelings of deep love and attachment between people who are having this experience and the person causing the harm. And so when we dismiss that, right, when we trivialize that, of course it sounds a lot easier to leave. But like it is a very hard and complicated thing to exit those relationships. And so when somebody, if they do go back, like a lot of times what we'll see family members do is they'll feel burned, right? They'll be like, "Ah, I told them this was going to happen and I gave them all these resources. Like, I can't help them next time they need this." And so, what I would always say to friends and family members when they call and they're like, "What do I do?" is I'd always say, one, don't tell the person what to do. Two, don't talk poorly about the person causing harm in the relationship. Tell them, tell your friend or family member the value you see in them. Tell them that they don't deserve what's happening and help to the level that you can help at 101 times. And what I mean by that is like, if you can't do this 101 times and still be there to show up for them, don't go that far because they might need you to be able to do this, right? Again. And if you're putting in so much that you will either feel frustrated or you won't be able to put this much in again, don't do that, right? Put in the amount that you can sustainably put into this so that you stay a resource and a support for this person. Because if you get shut off and cut off from this person, that's just made the abuse more powerful. So I think sometimes family members inadvertently reinforce these cycles by trying to help.
Yeah. And something that you touched on too, like there is that again factor. And I think that that is one of the big underlying assumptions is
Hmm.
that we have this single problem. And the single problem is this abusive relationship. And in
Hmm.
our really mathematical brains, we think we need a single solution to this.
Hmm.
And what I think that you've described in the model of care that you guys are providing is that it is not a single problem, it's an
Hmm.
orchestra of problems. And that whole orchestra of problems takes an even bigger orchestration of many solutions. And so
Hmm.
when we're talking about somebody who's coming in, it's not necessarily that they're coming in because they're going to just need the housing. Here I am.
Hmm.
Here's my child. We just need housing and then everything will be fine. It's not because maybe we get to housing and
Hmm.
then we still don't have a job history. And so we're going to need time with which to find steadier footing financially. And then maybe we've gotten to a point where we're a little bit steadier financially, but then we're going to be dragging through family court. And family court, for people who are listening and aren't aware, costs many times over
Hmm.
a mortgage for people.
Yeah.
So it's all of the solutions that you're offering within the same
Mhm.
program. And I think that's really important. And it's going to help prevent those short stints of what looks like success. And instead, it's enabling this long term empowerment to keep going, even though
Mhm.
the resolution's going to keep calling for more problem solving and possibly more resources for what can be a very long time.
Yeah. Oh, you said that beautifully. And I think too, the other really big reality, and I will say this every day, is like when you are a loved one watching somebody go through this experience, like the way you address something is different, right? Like you are not your family's doctors. You are not your family's attorneys. You should not be your family member's advocate either, because the way we come out swinging and try to do stuff for our humans is sometimes not is unintentionally harmful and can also sometimes take away that autonomy from survivors to make those choices to decide, am I ready to start this? Because what you just spoke to, like, this is much bigger than one thing. This is about often reshaping and redirecting every element of their life. And we need to give people time to come into that space and give them the autonomy to choose that.
Yeah, and in talking about supportive family members, loved ones, and friends too, I don't want to take for granted that any of those people, like, it becomes their own stress at some point, and it
Mhm.
becomes their
Yeah.
own, I think it's called secondary trauma. You would probably know better
Yeah.
than me, but it does become a part of them too. And so I think there's also encouragement in go go find your support as well
Yeah.
so that you're taking care of yourself. And then when you're showing up for that person who's in the abusive situation or recovering from it or trying to get out of it, whatever it is, that you get to show up having already been filled. And then
Hmm.
you've got a little bit of a better chance of staying in that regulated and supportive mode
Yeah.
instead of the very fair and very relatable Batman Gotham needs me, I will end this
Yeah.
type mode
Yeah.
that we want to go into.
Mm.
Um, so, can we talk a little bit more? Because one of the special things I think about the YWCA is the inclusion of the children. You've talked about these
Yeah.
beautiful summer camps and programs, and not just a space where like kids can be tolerated, but like a space created for them and to help nurture
Mm.
them and heal them through this process. What are some of the most important factors generationally that we need to be looking at for supporting the kids who have either suffered or witnessed these types of
Hmm.
abuse?
I think it's like starting there of like addressing it from a space of supporting the whole family, right? So we're not just saying this was the experience between the parents. We're saying, no, this was an experience for a whole family system, right? And so we are going to address it from that space. And we are going to honor that every kid in that family has probably had a different experience with it and has had different impacts. And so we're not going to create like this cookie cutter way we approach it. So I think that's step one is making sure that we are actually addressing it from a family umbrella space instead of being like, oh, well, we're working with the survivor and here's what they've gotten and here's how we're addressing it. But we are really addressing it from there. And we're also giving the survivor tools to parent in separation. So one thing that you'll often see is kids' behaviors will really spike when they're in a safe space because they're finally all that pressure those little bodies were feeling, all that fear they might have been feeling, they can finally kind of off like outlet, right? And so having a team around them who understands that's really important. Having a team around them that's going to be able to have positive interactions with their children and tell them like, here's this beautiful thing we did with your kid today. Whereas, like, many people aren't trained in the impacts of domestic violence on kiddos. So they might be getting a lot of reports from school or from childcare about their kids hitting, biting, like doing all these things that are often very age appropriate, but maybe their kids are doing it outside of age appropriate spaces, or maybe they're doing it at a frequency that's more, right? And so oftentimes they're getting really negative feedback about their kids because their kids are expressing their trauma in spaces where people don't know how to work with kids who have experienced trauma. So it's making sure that we're addressing it from a family space and then also making sure that we have people who are really trained in like what that looks like. Our kids program is also trained in this program called Window Between Worlds, and it's a like play-based art program that helps kids talk about how they feel, and it does it in a way in which kids won't even, we're not going to like, hey, let's sit down and talk about your feelings. We're able to be like, this is what a volcano looks like in your body. What does it feel like if you were a volcano? When do you know that might start to happen? How do you like act when that happens? Like, if that is happening, what are things that can help pull you out of being a volcano, right? And like they'll draw a volcano while they're talking about it and have the kid color it and like write a story about like a kid becoming a volcano and then, pulling out of being a volcano. Like, what does that look like? What would those tools be? Right. And so, like, helping the kids really establish and work on those like regulation factors, helping kids really establish and work on boundaries. Like, that's a huge thing of what we're doing often. And you'll watch the team do it in such beautiful and gentle ways with the kids. But those things are all about making sure those kids have tools for themselves in the here and now. And they also have tools as they age because they're not like often, those kiddos are still going to have a relationship with the person causing harm, right? It's a pretty common outcome that the kids will still, there'll be some level of custody arrangement or some level of access where the person causing harm in that family will continue to have some level of like parental access to that kid. And so it's important that we're building out tools and these ongoing skills for kiddos because there's a really high likelihood that they will continue to be in some level of relationship with this person. And if their part of that relationship includes time where they're spending with that person and that person gets in a new relationship, there is also the likelihood that they might see that person engage in these behaviors in a new relationship, right? So while it might not be their other parent that the person's harming, they still might see this again. And so it's really important that we're not just saying like one and done, here you go, but that we're really building up the tools for kids over time. And then after the age of 13, kids are able to consent to therapy, even if their parents are like, we don't want them in it. So that is something too, that like after the age of 13, a kiddo can choose to opt into therapeutic services as well.
And do you find often that in the situation where families are coming in with kids, that the person doing harm will use that parental time as a method to continue the abuse that they have perpetuated toward the survivor?
Kids are a huge part of abuse, right? So we see during pregnancy violence, if the physical violence is part of the abuse, we often see it rise. If physical violence hasn't been part of the abuse, that's sometimes where you'll see it start. Because pregnancy represents a pretty significant loss of control for the person causing harm. And at the heart of abuse is this person trying to maintain power and control, right, over the person they're harming. And so, from the get go of this parental dynamic, we will see the experience being used as a way to harm somebody. Once they have kids, we sometimes will see them utilize the kids as a way to like, well, if you leave, I'm gonna get the kids. Like they're not gonna let you take the kids. Or if you leave, I'm gonna harm the kids. Or, like, or them telling the kids stuff about the parent that's being harmed or passing messages. We definitely see that. And then post separation, we'll see them try to like maybe use the kids to relay information. We might see them use the pickup drop off times as a time to try to engage in abusive tactics. I remember like many years ago when we were just getting used to technology and how to safety plan around it. I was working with a survivor and, they had gotten a divorce and in the parenting, or they were in the process of getting a divorce and establishing their parenting plan. And the abuser was really firm that he wanted the kids to have cell phones when they were at each other's homes and that he would pay for the cell phones, which honestly, this feels so naive now. It's like, how did we not understand this? But like, honestly, at like that point in time, it felt like, okay, that's like kind of a win here, right? Like the kids having access to technology that they're able to use to contact mom when they're at the abuser's house, right? And he is doing it so that he can have contact to them when he's there at mom's house. But like, she's like, I feel like this is a calculation. The survivor's like, I feel like this is a calculation that we can safety plan around and like ultimately might create more safety for my kids. Well, ultimately, what he did is he was tracking the phones. And so he was able to figure out where she was living, right? So she had done everything. She had enrolled in the address confidentiality program. She had done all this really intensive safety planning with like her community to not share her information with him. She had made her address unknown in the court filings, like all of these things. And then he was able to utilize the kids as a means to figure out where she was living and engage in stalking behavior. So like we see them use the kids for a number of tactics and in a number of ways. I've also seen like, how you pay child support being a tool. So abusers, paying at the very last minute and then holding. So it's instead of a 30-day, it's like a 60-day window almost where you're like waiting for the next payment on child support. And like just doing these things that make it exponentially harder for the survivor. And they often use it as a way just to like keep that hook, right? Keep that behavior going on. And it's really difficult. And I think too, the thing that we can't underestimate is that most of the time, or not most of the time, but there's a high probability that this person causing harm will still have access to this kid. And a lot of times survivors are having to make that calculation of like, is it safer for me to be present and around when my kid's engaged with this person, thus staying in the partnership? Or is it safer to exit, create this safety for my kid over here, knowing that they still will probably have to be in spaces with this person who's caused harm? So I think like that's an incredibly hard calculation that people don't always fully take into account um, and consider when they're like, they should just leave.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking into like how many different layers there are. And I mean, we
Hmm.
still only touched on a few, but just touching like on those few, I think kind of it opens the window to exactly how many windows there are if someone is trying to make those types of decisions. And I think that's important
Yeah.
because it can seem, especially, and I get on one about this, especially the way it's portrayed in media, it can seem like such a cut and dry, well, just do this
Hmm.
and then you'd be
Hmm.
fine. So thank you for
Yeah.
speaking into that some more. Uh, what
Yeah.
about, so we talked a little bit about the barriers. What about eligibility? Who is eligible for these types of services?
So, any survivor of intimate partner violence, that is something that we're also really clear and firm about in how we do our care and services. We know that anybody can be a survivor of intimate partner violence, and our services are open to any survivors in our community. It doesn't matter what sex, what gender, what expression of who you are, and how you move through this world. There's no barriers to that. And the other thing too that's really important is there's not income limits. So like a lot of times people will be like, oh, is there a certain income you work with? And it's like, no, because intimate partner violence can happen at any income level. And one of the biggest tools of violence is like financial control. So we could have a survivor who, like pulls up in a car that you're like, wow, that's a really expensive vehicle. And it's like, and they might have no access to day to day funds. They might have no access to any money that's not being heavily monitored or tracked. And so, it's really important too that there's not income limits. So we work with, again, anyone who is a survivor of intimate partner violence.
And what about the children? Any age restrictions? Is everyone eligible for that?
Yep. They're all eligible for that. If they're like really old adult, that we're going to have a conversation about that. But if you're in a caregiving arrangement, so if somebody's like, I have a 25-year-old child who I am responsible to be their caregiver for X, Y, and Z reasons, we're not going to say, oh, you can't be in the shelter with your 25-year-old. We're going to say, okay, you screened in. Like I worked with a family in which the mom was in here and she had an adult child, a young adult child, but that adult child had a kiddo. And like it was a 3-generation household in our shelter because that was her household. Those were the
That's
people that she
incredible.
took care of. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
Abby, thank you so much for shedding so much light on this. I really
Yeah.
believe the more that people are talking about it and the better understood that it becomes that it's going to help disarm it just little by little. So I appreciate your
Mm.
time. The
Well, I
last,
appreciate what you're doing too, right? Like people need to talk about this.
yeah, thank you. The last question I'm going to throw at you, because I like to ask this of everybody,
Yeah.
is just in this crazy world, how are you taking care of yourself?
Mm. Okay, so this is like one of the things I've been talking a lot about this with people because I'm like, the reality is when you go into this work, you're going to be coming in spaces where you are working with humans who have had profound trauma. And that does mean there will be vicarious and secondary trauma. As a leader, one of the things that I really hold near and dear is like, we can't change that. That is part of the nature of this work. But what we can do is set up working environments that minimize burnout, that create space for as clear of expectations and balance in our team members' lives. And so, as a leader, one of the things that I really focus on is like, what can we do that can move the dial for people's well being? And then for myself, I am very on top of like basic self care and like hygiene. And so, what I mean by that is like, I work out 3 mornings a week. I try to make sure that I get a good amount of sleep. I make sure that I stay in good social connection with my family and with my friends. I eat balanced meals. And I know all these things sound like so basic, but they are really the building blocks that allow you to feel refreshed, allow you to feel engaged. And also, when I make sure that I take lunch, that means I'm getting up, walking away from my desk, I'm giving my brain time to like think through what I'm doing. And I'm also reinforcing that, like, I can step away from this work and the agency is here when I come back. And you need to model that to other people too, right? Even if it's those small things. Like, I have many peers in this work, and I'll always say to them, like, if you can't go to lunch and the agency crumbles while you're at lunch, there's an issue with how it's set up, right? Like, let's talk about that. You need to be able to do these small daily things that create health. And so that's what I do. Small daily things that create health. Try not to do anything too big. Try to journal for like 10 minutes every morning. Work out 3 times a week. Eat enough spinach. Nothing wild.
Eat enough spinach. The Popeye strategy. I
Yes,
love that.
that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Great. All right, Abby, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being a part of the S.E.E.N Summit. The movement to end domestic violence starts with you. Keep tuning in, because when we come together, we are disarming the monster that is domestic violence of its most terrifying weapon, its invisibility. We are a community of survivors, loved ones, and leaders together making the invisible epidemic seen. Please share what you've learned today with others. When you subscribe, like, or share this podcast, you help us to reach more individuals and organizations who can make a difference. We'll see you next time at S.E.E.N Summit.